welcome and Merry Christmas to everyone. Being festive, finally found my hat. Um, Today we're going to be talking about Agile Principle number 7, and working software being the primary measure of progress. And yes, I recently redid my network last night, so hopefully everything will bear with us. There are lots of changes. I think I finally found that the main problem I was dealing with was I had a bad cable somewhere, and I've replaced my entire Wi-Fi network because of it. But anyway, hopefully this will work well for everybody. Give me a thumbs up or something if you can hear okay. Find where the reaction buttons are and push something, any button that seems appropriate. Just want to make sure. Okay, great. So you know where those buttons are. Feel free to hit those at any time if there's something that you agree with, disagree with. There's lots of different options there, but feel free to do those as we go. It's a way to get feedback. Okay, so Agile Principle number 7. Let me start with a story. So there were these, there was a company that was putting in, they were going to put in telephone poles. And so they had hired two groups of people to do this, and the two groups were separate and very competitive with each other. And they set them both up heading opposite directions and said, okay, you put poles going this direction, you put poles going this direction. And the manager said, I'll come back at the end of the day and see how everything's going. So he came back at the end of the day, and the team that was headed to the left had 5 poles in the ground, all set up all the way. And so the manager said, hey, that's great. Looks like you were making great progress. Then he goes to the other team, and they only had 1 pole. And it seemed a lot lower than the other poles. But that team seemed very, very happy with their progress and stuff. And so he goes to him like, what's going on? You've only got 1 pole. It doesn't even look like it's in right. And he's like, the other team over there, they've got 5 poles all on the ground. And they looked over at him and said, well, yeah, if they don't put them in all the way. Anyway, the point of that story is that the way we measure progress is important. See, I didn't see a smile or anything on the reaction, so evidently that joke flopped horribly. Anyway, point of it being that there are the way we measure progress does matter. And when it comes to software, we need to be careful how we measure progress to make sure we're going to. Thank you, Anthony. I got a laughing face off that, so that's great. Just
TransUnion one, they want you to pay to get it. And I said, I'm not paying them.
Well, you shouldn't have to pay anything for this, but let me go and mute everybody because that might not be what you intend to be doing. Get everybody muted again. Okay. Okay, so question here for you, just to think about. If pro and con are opposites, what's the opposite of progress? Any thoughts on that? What would be the opposite of progress if pro and con are opposites? So just something to think about here as we talk about progress. So here's a question for you, or a cartoon. I like this. So we've got this cartoon. He's working on something. He says, when I started this morning, there were a few edge cases I was confused about. But now, after a full day of research, I'm confused about all the regular cases too. And the girl says, you made actual progress. So what type of progress has this cartoon character made? And there should be, you can go to the URL if you need to, or go to slido.com and type in that number over there, or it should be showing up for you in the chat. Right above the chat should say Slido. Yeah, so the opposite of progress may be Congress. I'm not sure. Maybe that's an artifact of the language. But what type of progress has cartoon character made? 1, he's more aware of how little he knows. He's more confused. His laptop battery is about to die. I noticed it's not plugged in, but in cartoon land, maybe that's fine. Or he's completed some research. What type of progress has he made? And I keep this box open if you open it, because we'll be doing stuff as we go throughout this in the cartoon. So if you go to in the chat and up above it, there should be a Slido thing, or you can go to slido.com and type that number in a window, and that will carry through for anything we do here. So let's see what people said. So he's more aware of how little he knows, which could be some type of, maybe that is some type of progress. As far as what he's actually accomplishing, though, maybe he hasn't made progress. And when I saw this cartoon, it made me think kind of about software, because how can we make progress when things are unknown? A lot of times when we're going in to work on software projects, we don't really have an idea. It's not like we know everything ahead of time, right? It's not like sometimes we can't even be sure how much needs to be done before we could say that we're done. And Agile gives us some tools or ways of thinking about this, about how we should be measuring progress. And that's the principle we're going to be looking at today. So Agile principle number 7, working software is the primary measure of progress. So we're going to walk through this and talk about different aspects of this. And the first thing we want to focus on is software. If we're saying working software is the primary measure of progress, that implies that we did something. We have software now that we didn't have before, that counts as some type of progress. And I think it's interesting. It doesn't say that we necessarily even had to write code to get this software. With a lot of stuff, and I mean, Agile was created well before we started pushing all these things to the cloud, but it may be that we get working software to work without actually having to write any or very much code. But the point is, it does something, right? It's software that does some type of work for us. And so that's kind of, I think it's important to be thinking in terms of the difference between software and code. And the reason that's important is because, and as a developer, I fall prey to this too, it's very easy to get so focused on producing code that we forget that this is how we're measuring progress. If I get so focused on producing code, I may lose sight of what I'm actually trying to accomplish. And that's where this principle becomes very, very important, is to make sure that we are laser focused on what we're delivering, something that does work for the customer, not just I've written a whole bunch of code. There are situations you'll get into to where you can get working software maybe without having to write a lot of code. And that may be the most efficient thing to do. Maybe it's a matter of you're finding a cloud service that you can stand up and instantiate that does some big body of what you're needing to do. That would be progress if it actually produces something that does work for the customer. So working software is okay, so we talked about software. Well, working software. Well, I like how this calls out that it's not just having lots and lots of software. If we think as an example of maybe a factory that's making cars, it's not enough just to have a bunch of cars sitting around in the parking lot, right? The cars coming off the other end. They've got to get out there to where they're actually being used before the company makes profit from it. By the word working in this principle helps us stay focused on the fact that it needs to be doing work. And there can be nuances here between the idea of something working meaning it is capable of doing work and working meaning it is actually doing work. I gave an example before of Tesla, that the way that they run their self-driving code is they've got a shadow mode on the car that runs the next version of the software or software that they're testing. It doesn't actually control the car, but it takes all the inputs and figures out how it would react in each situation. So that's running all the time on people's cars all across the United States. Then what it does is it compares that to what the real user does. And if it finds a situation that real users do one thing, but the code does something else, the person driving the car would tell the car to stop at this light, but the car's software would tell it to go through. Then they go through and look at that and say, okay, there's some way here this is behaving differently than the way that the humans do it. And it may be that everyone runs these type of red lights, but it also may be that the car's not doing something that it should be. And I think that's a good example of working software, because the software is actually doing real work on real inputs. It's not a matter of just, hey, we did this, we tested it on a track, and look at all the great stuff it's doing. Okay, now we're done. No, the software is actually getting out there and getting real information fed into it. Now, most of us probably aren't working on self-driving car systems, but I've been on teams that what they did to make sure that their software was working software is they set up a parallel environment to the system that they were trying to replace. And in this case, there were lots of files coming in. And so whenever they had, each week they'd push new code out to it, or sometimes even several times a week, and the files would split, and all of them would go to the system of record, but they'd also go to the new system. So that software was doing work on real data. Now, it wasn't the system of record. It wasn't like it was, it didn't change anything. People were still using the old system, but work was being done. I think if you're looking at your software, what you're producing, thinking really hard about how can we make sure that our software is being executed in a way that's doing real work. Because if we defer and wait for it to do work, we may be hiding lots of stuff. We may be taking on risks that we don't necessarily need to. So working software means we've got our software doing something that's doing work. And yes, it's great to test it and everything, but doing work means it's actually doing something, right? And if we lose sight of that, we can end up with a situation where we've got lots of software that worked great when we tested it or when we wrote it, or we think it does great, but then there's all this hidden work to actually get it to where it's useful. So to say it's working means it does something useful, and being busy does not equal progress. So one thing I see on a lot of teams is when we're not being driven by working software being the primary measure of progress, it's very easy for teams to start talking in terms of how do I make sure I get credit for the work I did. And this is one, sometimes a big push against mob programming and pair programming and really taking a team approach to things. Because if a team is focused on, if the individuals on a team are focused on how do I get credit for the time I spent doing stuff, that is a very different mentality than thinking about as a team, how do we deliver working software? So if you're working with a team that seems maybe overly focused on how do I get credit for the time I spent? If I was busy, I want to make sure that I get credit for the time I was busy. If you notice, the Agile Manifesto doesn't say anything about we need to measure how busy people were, right? It's the working software, the things that are actually produced that really matter. And so this is a good principle to bring people back to, saying, are we actually focusing on delivering working software? And that's how we're making progress. Is that the thing that I feel like I'm getting kudos for? Is the fact I delivered working software to the user? Or is it the fact that I spent 80 hours this week trying to research the best framework for X, Y, and Z? I very well may needed to do that, but that shouldn't be the thing that I'm feeling actually is considered progress in our environment. Another good way to think of working is, can a user demonstrate the new software and tell how it makes their life better? There was a discussion on LinkedIn the other day that I was participating in, and people were asking how to make sure that their user stories were actually being chunked in ways that could be delivered to the user and that were meaningful to the user. And this is one of the questions I really like to ask, is saying, is what we're delivering something that a user could demonstrate, explain what it does and why it's important? And if we're building our software in chunks that look like this is going to be very easy to do. Working software being the primary measure of progress will be very easy to show. If you're in a situation, though, where you're delivering stuff or counting as progress, things that the user can't actually demonstrate to the stakeholders and say, hey, this is what it does, this is why this is a good thing, this is why this is important to me, it may be a matter, you may have a very difficult time actually using working software as the primary measure of progress. And I recognize there are sometimes software that's really hard to find the way the user uses it, or it may be something that you need to do some work that's not readily apparent to the user. But in almost every situation when I've been coaching with teams and they're saying, oh yeah, this is something the user won't understand, usually it's not an issue. Usually the story can be designed in a way that the user can understand it and in a way that's important to them. It's just that we're not delivering it in that way. So if we slice our stories to where we can actually get working software into the user's hands, even if it's very, very small, but something that has meaning to them, it can push us toward following the Agile principles a lot better. And as an example, so imagine two teams, and I've been on projects that kind of had teams that were segmented, and they kind of did this. There was one team that was really focused on, and just to keep the example, let's say both of them are trying to deliver a UI that does something. It's a multi-step workflow process. And you've got one team that's going out first and trying to figure out, putting lots of effort in trying to figure out a system for tracking messages across. I put something on here and it keeps track of it as it moves through these different stages and stuff. And so they've spent an entire sprint working on that. And then they spend another sprint building the first page that has 50 different fields on it that all need to go to different places on the database and stuff. And so the next iteration, they deliver that thing with 50 on. It doesn't actually submit to anything. It's just the UI, right? So the user can't really use it to do anything yet, but it's all built out there. And the next thing, they work on the next piece. And after a number of iterations, they finally get something that the user can actually see how part of it works. So that's kind of one extreme of not doing this. The other side of things is the team was looking at it and saying, okay, well, we know we need to, like, let's say a loan, somebody submitting information for a loan, something like that. Well, they're going to have a name and they're going to have an amount that they're requesting and about 50 other fields. But let's see if we can get just the name and the amount they're requesting and maybe one other piece of information. We're going to give them the ability to type that in and then show that it's moved to the next stage. There's lots of more fields that we need, but we're going to make this piece work for the user so the user can sit down and actually execute this, which means we need to get our testing in place just for those 2 or 3 fields. We need to get it deployed somewhere that the user can use it, and get all that working. And that type of approach, where you're driven by here's how we're going to demonstrate this to the user, something they can actually do, lets you follow this principle of working software being the primary measure of progress. You can show you did something, right? And the opposite of that approach, every time I've seen teams try to do that, they end up taking on dramatic amounts of risk that usually comes back to bite them. I was working with one company I went into. They were doing a bunch of stuff internally, and they needed something done external that interfaced with their back-end system. So we came in, and my company does software engineering in addition to Agile coaching and training, we also do some software engineering projects. So we built this external piece that interfaced with the public to talk to their back-end system. And while we were building it, they were trying to launch a new back-end system. And so I was talking to one of the chief executive officers there, and I said, well, this is great. It sounds like what you're building is going to be very, very powerful and everything. How much of it is live? And he said, none of it's live. He said, as a matter of fact, our CEO hates software projects because we always spend millions of dollars and don't have anything to show for it. And in this case, I found out they had been working on this project for 5 years, and not a single part of it was actually producing any value for them. Well, that's not following this principle, right? If we're following this principle that working software is the primary measure of progress, we're going to try to find ways to get pieces of it working and then build the system up. And in this case, we were able to deliver the front end for it, and they were very happy with that because in a few months they had something that people were actually using, whereas the other they'd spent 5 years and no one was able to use it yet. And they eventually got parts of it running. But anyway, working software is the primary measure of progress. I think this is interesting because this implies that we are measuring something. And this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I want us to think about, why should we worry about how we measure stuff? Like, is it important how we measure stuff? Yeah, it says working software is the primary measure of progress, but does that matter? Does it matter how we actually choose to measure things? So I want to show you a video. For those of you outside of the US, this will probably be even funnier. But I want to show you this video, and then Tizzy, I'll check your question while the video is going. And this is a look at a way of measuring things that just seems a little bit insane when it comes just to measuring the length of things. So hope you enjoyed this video. This is Jimmy Rees, a comedian from, I think, Australia. I encourage you to look him up. But just to emphasize the point that we should be concerned about how we measure stuff in lots of different circumstances. So the guy who decides...
Hello, sir. Today we're deciding how long something is.
Wonderful, Jason.
Okay, let's start small.
Line up some barley corn.
What, but won't they all be different sizes?
Do I even have to say it, Jason?
Say what?
Shut up, Jason!
All right, fine. Line up barley corn. How many?
3.
Right, 3. And what's that called?
An inch.
3 barley corn is an inch. If we put some inches together, we should call that something.
Okay, Jason.
How about a nice round number, like 10?
12.
12.
Yes.
Okay, and what do we call that?
Well, Jason, 12 inches is about the size of my foot. Ha!
Yeah, so...
Call it a foot, Jason!
A foot. Okay, what about a hand?
A hand? That's a third of a foot.
Wait, what?
And half a hand is called a stick.
Right, you're serious.
And half a stick is an inch.
Okay, so just let me just work that out. So that...
Oh, and Jason, 3 of those inches is called a palm.
Well, this isn't confusing at all. Can we just go back to the foot? If we put some feet together, what do we get?
A yard.
So I put down 12 feet is a yard.
No, Jason, why would you say that?
Well, we had 12 inches in a foot, so I was just keeping with the 12 thing.
Jason, what experience do you have creating measurement units?
About the same as you, sir. None.
Then there will be 3 feet in a yard.
Fine, what's next?
A mile.
Right, and how many yards in a mile?
1,000.
Oh, that's a nice round number.
750. No, wait. 60.
So 1,760 yards in a mile.
Yes, Jason. And 1/8 of a mile is a furlong.
An eighth? Oh, sir, can we just divide something by 10 or 100 just to make it a little simpler?
Okay, smarty pants. We'll divide a furlong by 10.
Oh, you're listening to me? Oh, okay. And what's that called?
A Gunther's chain.
That's weird, but whatever. What's next?
A fathom.
Okay, and we divide the chain by 10 to get a fathom?
Yes.
Great!
Actually, no.
What?
11. Divided by 11.
What? No!
But don't worry, Jason. 100 fathoms is a cable.
100?
You wanted it easier, didn't you, Jason?
It's a bit too late for that.
10 cables is a mile.
No, wait, that's not right. That maths doesn't work out.
Fine, call it a nautical mile.
What's a nautical mile?
And 3 of those is a league.
Wait, just stop. How many feet in a nautical mile?
6,000 and carry the 180. 6,080.
Sorry, sir, but we started at a barley corn and we've gone at feet and inches and miles and nautical miles, and it's very confusing. Surely it all can't come back around and end up back in a barley corn.
Say it with me. Jason, Jason, Jason. The schools you went to should be ashamed of themselves for graduating an idiot like you.
Right, now everyone will be saying Jason, Jason, Jason.
63,360 inches equals a standard mile, Jason. Not to be confused with the Roman mile, which is 60,000 inches. And while we're speaking of inches, inches can be divided by 6, and that makes a beaker. And guess what, Jason? 12 points make up a beaker. And if you divide a point by 6, you get a line. And the line is the exact same length as a poppy seed. And guess what 4 poppy seeds equals, Jason?
I don't know.
A barleycorn, Jason! Now, if you'd excuse me, I'm going to fill up my drink. Goodbye, Jason.
Yeah, alright, bye. Sounds completely ridiculous. What kind of stupid country would ever use that?
Okay, so that was just a little bit fun, but the point is that the way we measure things actually matter. And as outrageous as that sounds, that is actually what we do in the US, is we have all these different types of measurements we're using for things, and a lot of them have the history that he was describing. But when it comes to software, I've seen projects measured in ways that are equally crazy, and we're measuring things that have nothing to do with actually delivering value to the user. And Tizzy had a good question. If your team works on back-end systems and doesn't have access to a UI, there is so first of all, if we're delivering software in a way that that doesn't actually satisfy something that the user needs, we may want to look at just how we're delivering software, right? If I have a team over here that's delivering just back-end stuff and a team over here that has to do the UI for it, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to deliver an increment of something that's useful. So in some cases, you're better off breaking those up to be able to deliver full slices all the way through. The other thing is a lot of times there are back-end things that do have customers and users that aren't necessarily the person using the UI. Sometimes you can have situations where your customer is actually another team that needs certain things done. Now that gets a little bit tricky but if you're actually satisfying a need of another team, maybe that becomes your user. Now the problem is if we carry that to the logical extreme, you end up with a case where you're not actually delivering anything for your real customers that are paying. So the further you're away from the people that are actually helping you make money and stay in business, the more risk you're incurring by doing that. But that is a good question. Usually what I would recommend is try to think about how you deliver stuff in ways that delivers a full slice of value. And if you're working on something that by itself is not valuable to anyone, that might be an indication you need to slice things in different ways. Okay. Working software as a primary measure of progress also implies that we should be measuring things. So it doesn't support the idea of people saying, we have no idea how much it is done. And I've been on Agile teams where the fact they're using Agile starts being used an excuse for not actually saying, here's how far we've made it and here's how far we have to go. We want to be agile and flexible, but that doesn't mean we're not measuring anything. If we're if people are using Agile to say, oh, we don't need to worry about how much is done, we just keep on doing stuff, and there's no reason to actually measure or hold ourselves accountable for what we're getting done, bring it back to this principle, because this implies that we are actually measuring something. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Okay, so here's another cartoon in thinking in terms of progress. So XKCD again, and he's asking, can you pass the salt? And he waits a while, and then he finally starts to repeat himself, and the person at the other end of the table says, I know, I'm developing a system to pass you arbitrary condiments. He says, it's been 20 minutes. He said, it'll save time in the long run. I have heard this type of conversation happen a lot of times on software development teams. And the idea of we're wanting to deliver something, create the system to do something arbitrarily, isn't necessarily bad in and of itself, but it can, if it keeps us from making progress, it can actually make us take on a lot more risk than what Agile would encourage us to do. So a question for you, how much progress has been made on passing the salt in this particular case? Okay, he's asking for salt, it's been 20 minutes, and then that comment, so when that last frame happens, how much progress has been made? What do you think? And if you just joined, you can go to the Slido link over there, or slido.com, and type in the number. It also should show up next to the chat, so feel free to use either way. So let's see, and it looks like you say 0. He still can't salt his food, right? Now, 25%, they're probably underestimating the cost of the system, and 50% say they're almost through with the planning. Now, maybe that's, I hope we're kind of joking there, but I've seen this type of logic used in software teams where the customers ask for one thing, and the team's gone off, myself included sometime, and tried to come up with a way to solve all those types of problems. And we've spent several weeks on it, but we still haven't delivered anything. And we consider ourselves that we're halfway there, or 25% of the way there. The reality is, and what Agile is saying, no, don't count that as progress until you've actually delivered something. And if we keep to that and don't count it on progress till we've actually delivered something for them, it does a couple things. One, it forces us to deal with smaller bites of things. We're less likely to go out and just build a huge framework and hope it's going to work. We're more likely to have to say, okay, I know this framework is what we may want to build a framework that works like this, but what's the smallest piece of it we could possibly build to deliver this in this iteration? And then we'll grow from there. And we may eventually grow to the point that we've created this framework, but it's going to be guided by our need to deliver working software on a consistent basis. In the real world, you would have a way to manually pass the salt until the improved system is complete. Yes, that's a very good point. And a lot of teams I've worked with, just bringing up kind of the rule of 3, that the first time you encounter something, just find a way to do it. The second time you encounter it, you may want to be thinking about a generic way to deal with that. Take what you learned from the first one, though, but just go ahead and deliver it. And the third time you get to it, that's probably the point that you would actually have enough information to build something that, build a framework or a library or something like that. But if you do it ahead of that time, you're probably going to end up needing to redo it all anyway. So you might as well wait to that. That third point is the point that you've seen this 3 times, you probably know enough to invest in it, and you probably have an idea it's going to happen again, and it's worth investing in. Okay, Monito was asking about the form's not usable by the end user at this point. Are you saying this supports working software in progress can be counted as progress? So the two extremes, obviously the best thing is something you can actually deploy all the way to production and they can start using. That would be the ideal. Sometimes you have things, though, that you cannot fit into one iteration. And what I'm suggesting is if something doesn't fit into an iteration, slice it up to where the user can actually do something, like the person that's going to be using it can actually do something with it, even if it's a small piece that goes all the way through. So if the user can go in and say, I need to enter information about a loan, and I can type, I have an idea of what that workflow is going to look like, but we're going to start with, I type their name and the amount they want to loan, and that gets put in the system, and then it goes to the next page where somebody approves it. That's a very small piece. That wouldn't be sufficient for doing a loan, but now I can get the users actually working through the software. If I just build the back end, the user still can't do anything with it. They can't actually do any type of, they can't execute the software. So for them, it's still a black box. Now, if I build just those two fields, we now can have all kinds of conversations about what's the next field you want to see. And they might talk about it and say, okay, we know we need to have their social security numbers, all these other fields, they're just text fields, but we've got this one field that we need to pull something from another system. That's probably the highest risk one. Let's add that one next and take that through. So that's the idea there. Ideally, you want something that you can take to production and people can use. But if you can't for some reason, don't back out and don't back off so much that you don't actually deliver something that the end user can actually work through and demonstrate to show why it's valuable to them. Working software is the primary measure of progress. That implies there may be other things that are measured. So it's not bad if there are other things measured, but we want to make sure that those other things never take the place of the primary way that we're measuring stuff. Okay, so working software, primary measure of progress. That covers me wanting to walk through the words in this. So we'll give something away here. We'll give away a copy of, just because I've got a lot of them, my productivity book. So this book right here, we will send your way to, we'll tell you what, we'll do the top 3 winners, get a copy of this book sent in the mail. If you're outside the United States, talk to me and we'll see if there's a way to get you one there. But if you're in the United States, I'll send it to you. If you're somewhere, some places, the cost of shipping is much greater than the value of the book. But okay, so get joined up. We'll do this and then we'll take any questions or anything people may have. Okay, so I'll give you just a few more seconds here. I'm going to check one thing. Well, okay, cool. Okay, 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, what does Agile say should be your team's primary measure of progress? Is it tickets completed, stories completed, working software, or iterations accepted? 2 seconds left. Yes, working software. Now, it's a little bit trick question here, because I think we should be able to, if the team's functioning well, the stories completed should represent working software. But the reason that it's not just the stories completed is the working software implies we've actually got it deployed, it's an environment where people can use it, and lots of other things that sometimes we don't actually include as part of our story. So that's why the Agile Principle number 7 focuses on working software instead of just saying stories completed. Okay, we've got Chris, Jarrett, Terrence, Richard, and Monita. Next question. What is probably the least valid evidence that software is working? Is it if the user's tried it and says it works, the developers are done coding, the team has tested it, or the automated tests have been run? Which is the least valid evidence that the software is working? And yes, I see we've got, so the one I was thinking of was the developers are done coding. Because I've seen lots of cases where the developers are done coding, but hasn't been tested, hasn't been deployed. Maybe even the automated tests haven't been run yet. So that's the one that I would say is the least valid evidence that the software is working. Maybe you work in environments that the user's trying it and say it works. You've had experience that isn't a good indication. But just because the developers are done coding, there's probably other work that needs to be done to get to the point that we can say that the software is working. Okay. Okay, we've got Chris, Eliza, Jack, Jennifer, and Terrence. According to Agile Principle number 7, should researching frameworks count as progress? Should we count researching frameworks as progress? Yes, because it takes time. Yes, because it needs to be done. Not until it produces software that can do some work. Or yes, because we have to pay people to do it. So yes, not until it produces software that can do some work. And what's the beauty of this, if you've worked on a team that really focuses on that working software is the primary measure of progress, you end up taking a very different approach to a lot of this research stuff. There's some things that you can deliver with the idea of you're punting on the research until you built a little bit more of it and have a better idea of what you need. You also end up doing often making investments in testing. And this is a really big thing with this principle. If I'm wanting to deliver working software, I need some way to be able to prove that it's working. That might be fine to have just manual tests happening, but in a lot of cases, if I'm really wanting to follow that principle and want to be able to say this is working, I may need to invest in automated tests. So this is one of the principles that indirectly pushes you toward investing in building tests as part of what you're delivering. So as far as researching frameworks, saying yes because it takes time, I would challenge you to think in terms of just because something takes time does not mean it should count as progress. And there are things that take time that are valuable that we don't want to count as progress lest they steer us in the wrong direction. And so even if it needs to be done, what really needs to be done is delivering the software. The fact it takes time, then we're going to deliver software based on it. That's great. But the proof that the research actually was valuable to us is our ability to deliver software from it. So that's where this principle, I think, is really powerful and we sometimes overlook, is that it forces us to count progress in a way that takes all this other work and helps channel it into the way that it's actually producing value rather than letting it take on a life of its own. It's easy for software teams to get so focused on doing research that they defer delivering something valuable because they're so focused on the research aspect of things. Now, the argument that you hear a lot of times in that is people saying, yes, but if we don't research this well, we'll deliver a bad result. And that is, I understand the concern of that. If we're actually following all the Agile principles and trying to be able to deliver small pieces through quickly, you end up building an infrastructure around it, particularly with your testing and just the way that you work together, that insulates you from a lot of that. So if we start with a framework saying, I know I can do this, this meets the needs we have today, instead of spending 6 weeks researching everything else we could do, we're going to work on delivering this, but we're going to preserve the option to switch this out later, not by building a bunch of stuff that we might not need, but by building really robust testing. So if later on we decide, hey, you know what, this backend thing that we're using, this backend framework doesn't meet our needs anymore, we can switch it out and have confidence it works because of the testing that we built around it. Okay, leaderboard, Chris, Eliza, Jennifer, Jack, and Daniel in the top spots. Principle number 7, should encourage teams to do what in their daily stand-ups? This one's going to be a little bit tricky. Should it make them talk faster, start tickets as soon as possible, swarm around finishing tickets on the right, or ask management not to attend? What should principle number 7 encourage teams to do in their daily stand-up? And yes, it should encourage them to swarm around tickets, finishing tickets on the right. So on typical boards, unless maybe it's in Hebrew or something, the stories all the way over on the right are the ones that are closest to being done. Those are the ones closest to being able to say, this is working software we can give to the user. So if we are laser focused on the way that we measure progress is delivering working software, we're probably going to want to start with the tickets that are way over on the right, the things that we can actually get progress for. Starting new tickets as soon as possible wouldn't actually help us it will eventually make progress, but it means that we're choosing to work on something that has a longer time period before it makes progress, instead of taking the things that are almost where we can count them as progress and finishing that. Now, as far as asking management not to attend, I don't think this principle would necessarily do that unless you've got management that you feel is hampering your progress, which would be an unfortunate case if that's it. And I know some teams like having management there, some people don't. But the big point of this is just thinking about how do we finish stuff, get it all the way done to where it's working software in the hands of the user. Okay, Chris still in the top spot. Eliza, Jarrett, Daniel, and Tizzy. We got one more question. Let's see if Chris can retain the top spot here. Why are stories better than tickets for defining work? Okay, I didn't talk about this a lot, but let's see what people come up with. Because tickets sound like you got pulled over for speeding, because some tools don't support tickets, because tickets are too granular, or because stories imply that the user can use the system to do work. And yes, although the ticket's too granular, you could probably make a case for kind of that being similar to this last one, but stories imply that well-written stories are going to say, here's how the user's world looks differently now, and here's what the user experiences. So the stories imply that the user can use the system to do something that they couldn't do before. Whereas with most teams, tickets are more of I'm going to go research this or do that. And I I would think about, and one thing I try to encourage teams to do is if they need tickets to keep track of work, that's fine. But don't count that in anywhere in terms of progress. Because if I start looking at my tickets in terms of progress, it pushes me away from the idea of working software being the primary measure of progress. So if I've got a story, what I'm trying to give to the user that will make their life better, I want to make sure that all my efforts are focused on delivering that, and all my sense of accomplishment and what I feel good about and my sense of progress and what I'm telling management we're accomplishing and stuff is all driven around these user stories or things that are working software that the user can experience. If I create 100 tickets to deliver one of these, that shouldn't matter. If that's a helpful way for me to for the team to keep track of stuff that we're working on, that's fine. Now, I find that when we start doing that, oftentimes it takes attention away from the ticket and people start feeling like they're accomplishing things because they had a task to go and do X, Y, and Z. An example of this, I was working with one team, a larger team, so they were divided up into several groups. One team one group was very, very focused on user stories. And matter of fact, they very rarely use tickets for anything just because they're like, we're not counting that as progress. Why would I keep track of this? I know I'm keeping you in suspense to see who won, right? So they were very, very focused on delivering tickets. There was another group that was very, very focused. They were very focused on delivering stories, so very focused on working software. The other group was very focused on delivering tickets. And what happened is they had tickets that were sometimes at the level of change this parameter on a server somewhere. I mean, it was literally something that was just going in and changing a parameter. But when it came time for demos, they were demoing that as progress, that we went in and changed this parameter on the server after 2 weeks of working on this. And it was very amazing to see how much difference there was in what was delivered just based on what the teams were focused on. And on one side, we had a bunch of tickets that got done and were being demoed independently. And the users, the stakeholders, the people that we were building the software for were like, why are they showing us this? We have no idea what it does. It doesn't mean anything to us. And it seems like something that should go pretty quickly. Whereas when teams were focused on actually delivering user stories, they were describing everything in the standpoint of what the user was able to do with it. And it made a very, very big difference on how much they got done. Because with the tickets, the work would usually expand because it didn't have that working software kind of constraining it down to what was actually needed to deliver value. Okay, so stories imply user can use the system to do work. So congratulations, Chris, Tizzy, and Kevin. Looks like you're in the top spots. And 1 second ahead of the next people there. So send me an email with your address and I will get a copy of this book sent to you. Productivity, Making the Difference. And this was, it's a bunch of things about how to, everything from how to sort your socks to optimal parking strategies. So all kinds of interesting things I hope you'll enjoy that I wrote here a while back. Okay, just to let you know, coming up next week, we'll probably just do a game day and give lots of stuff away. So that's probably going to be next week. Then we'll take a break and pick up after January. If there is anyone that you think this would be a great person to have on an Agile Lunch and Learn, please send me an email. Let me know who it is or a particular topic. I'd love to get that on the schedule for next year if I can reach out to them if they're willing to come. Also to let you know, if your team is looking for Agile coaching or training or needs software engineering help, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to talk to you about things coming up in the next year. Many of you probably got the email about, the end of the year doing some training. I've met with several teams. We've had a great time doing some of those training things. So that's always an option in the coming year. Please reach out if that's of interest. And with that, does anyone have any questions about this? And by questions, it can also be disagreements. You can say, I think that answer was wrong or anything else.
Hey, Mark, I have a question.
Yes.
Oh.
So sometimes we'll have priorities in our board, and those priorities of those tickets will have varying degrees of complexity. So we may actually have that are not prioritized that might be considered low-hanging fruit. Is it worth working on the low-hanging fruit with the idea that you can get those things done quickly, and that adds to working software? Or
So
is it better to go with the priorities that product is aligning you with?
you broke up a little bit, and I think what you're saying is you've got 5 or 6 things on the board. Some of them you can deliver very quickly, but some of them the customer is saying are higher priority. Is that the case?
Yeah, not necessarily. I guess the customer through our product managers. Sure.
Okay. So what I would, but it sounds like these stories are the ones they're saying are priority are a lot larger than the ones you're considering low hanging fruit, right?
That's the scenario that I'm trying to
Okay.
deal with. Yes.
So in that situation, what I would try to do is work with the customer to identify the parts of what they're saying are high priority to do those parts of those things first. In a lot of situations, they ask for X, Y, and Z, but when you really start talking to it, they just assumed that you had to do Z. You couldn't do X and Y without Z. And the part that they thought was really, really valuable is actually X. And when you tell them you can do X without doing Y and Z, they'd be happy to get that instead of waiting for the rest of it. So those types of conversations can sometimes take the highest priority, split it into different pieces, and then you got the highest priority thing, which is also the thing you can deliver the fastest. So that's what I would try to, can't always do it, but I would try to make sure you're having conversations so in the places that could happen, it does happen.
Okay. Thank you very much.
But and also along those lines, what you don't want to be doing is delivering lots of stuff that the customer doesn't think is valuable, right? And that's where the collaboration becomes really important, is making sure you're working with them, because customer doesn't know how long things take, right? They don't know what's easy or what's hard or what's maybe even impossible, and the developers usually don't know how it's actually valuable to them. And too often there's a lot of waste that just occurs because there's not a conversation happening about, well, what piece of this is valuable to you, and figuring out how to deliver the smallest thing that has the highest value. That's a good question.
Mark, can I go next?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I'm dying over here because David's on one of my teams and I had no idea he was here. So I feel like my work is not done, but further to the right. Anyway, I just wanted to confirm, am I one of the people who gets one of these books?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm good. All right.
Okay.
That's it.
And
Thanks.
Teyaba, I see you were asking, how can I help my teams to swarm on stories? Most of the time I hear multiple people can't work on it. If you've got a couple things to think of, is make sure that your story actually includes everything that can happen. So a lot of times we'll end up and say, oh, well, this needs to be tested by Joe and no one else can help Joe test it. Well, that might be an indication that next time Joe tests something, Bob or Sue ought to test it with them so they can actually help with it. If your work is actually delivering user stories and not just individual tickets, there probably is the ability for people to work on things together. If you're just doing tickets, like I've seen some tickets that are so granular, it's like saying, go in here and type this in this field, and most of the work has actually happened in writing the ticket. Then sometimes that's not the case.